Okay, I have us at the top of the hour. Am I supposed to say something useful like we should wait our customary 1 minute for latecomers, or maybe we should get started? Um, I think I'm going to vote for getting started and moving into the meeting here. Uh, we do have quite a full agenda, although we do have a little bit of time at the end, but we have a lot of different topics to get through, and I suspect at least one potentially newish topic that will take up some time, so that'll be fine. So I am Jim Galvin. Antoine Verschoren is the big head over there on the side on the screen, the co-chair of this working group. I'm going to kick us off here through the first half of the agenda, and then he's going to pick up and run through the rest. And welcome to the REGEXT working group at IETF 117. Moving on. Um, this is the standard note well, and although it's only Tuesday, I'm sure that everyone here has seen this at least 3 or 4 times over the course of your day yesterday. So please do keep in mind that you are participating in a public forum, and any contribution that you make here is part of this public forum and part of this process. As well, please also be respectful and kind and express yourself in a tactful way in these meetings throughout the IETF, but here in particular, it really is very important. Our role is about doing what's best for the internet, not about taking exception with each other. So thank you for that. Okay, agenda bashing. Our agenda is reasonably pro forma. We do typically talk about status of some of our documents. Then we move into current work and potential new work. And that's basically what's going on here. But here's your opportunity for agenda bashing. Anybody want to jump out and make a comment about the large set of topics here? And not seeing any hands or jumping at the microphone here, we shall continue on. We are actually in the midst of our welcome. Oops, what happened to the slides? They disappeared from my screen. Oh, they're still over here, but they're off my laptop. Okay, well, that's fine. So we'll do the welcome and introductions. I'll just flip the slides this way while my laptop figures itself out. In terms of note scribing, we will take advantage of the transcript that comes from these meetings. We think that that serves nicely as notes, but we would welcome if anyone wants to, please do go into the notes area, and it should be pre-populated with the agenda for the meeting. And if you want to capture specific action items and particular notes from any element of the meeting, we'd certainly greatly appreciate that. Anyone who wants to jump in there and do that for us. So thank you very much for that. In terms of document management, Antoine and I have been moving forward and doing more. Oh, gee, okay. Now the server slides also dropped off, but they're coming back. Okay. We've been doing better with document management in terms of being able to make sure we have document shepherds. We have one document that we'll get to as we're going along here that still does not have a document shepherd. We'll call that out when we get there. But many thanks to folks who have been jumping in and helping out with that, and of course participating in reviewing documents and such. Okay. I don't have the slides here, and this little clicker is not working.
Yeah,
Antoine,
well, Jim, apparently you have logged out of the of Meet Echo, so that's why the slides disappeared. So I will do the slides for you, right?
yeah. Go ahead to the next slide. While I see why my laptop won't be logged in here. Okay, and so next slide, please. We don't have any new documents published this time around, same as last time, but I think we have a bunch in the hopper here, so that's moving along quickly. So we do have a couple of documents that have been submitted to the IESG. Let me take the second one first here. The RDAP reverse search capabilities is, last time we checked the status here, it's still waiting on a revised document from the authors after AD review, but then it will get sent around for its IETF last call, and the AD will move it forward. So that's just a minor step here that has to happen. And then we have the internationalized email addresses. I did send a summary note last night to the mailing list describing the status of this document from the point of view of the working group. I also know it's no longer in my line of sight here. Murray's actually in the room. I think that, Murray, did you want to make a comment about this document at this point here from your point of view based on the status? Please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Jim, for the summary. It's helpful to switch back all the context since it's been a while since I think we've seen this. The one thing I want to focus on about in the summary you included is that the working group feels that the outstanding EAI related issues are out of scope for the working group. And I'd like to understand what that justification is. When this comes to the ISG for review, we can't sort of sweep aside these matters, that we have ways of dealing with internationalized email addresses that are fairly well established. And in my mind, that's like saying, well, we don't have to bother with IPv6, even though like dealing with IPv6s will draw lots of resistance. This is the same kind of, we don't feel like we need to deal with it. I'd really like to understand why that's true.
So if I understand the comment and the question, what we're saying here is we chose a particular path in the working group for this document. We only allow carriage of one email address, and the issue is that we need to explain why that is the right answer.
Right.
As opposed to, we either we have to explain why that's the right answer, being that as John Clinton, I think, was the primary one, but there were others
Right.
who were along the way speaking to this issue of always having the option of having an all ASCII email address available.
Right. I specifically remember attending the Philadelphia meeting, and Pete Resnick was at the mic saying essentially the same kind of thing and offering the same sort of solution. This document has been revised, I think I counted 6 or 8 times, some number of times since then. And the only change I can really see is that EAI has gone and replaced by SMTP UTF-8. The thing we're now talking about has not been addressed at all. There's not even a comment in the document to explain why we think this is out of scope. And I don't think it's in the Shepherd write-up either. So if this gets all the way to the ISG and this remains an open issue that will be brought up during last call, it is virtually certain to get blocked by the ISG. So we either need to explain why this is the right path forward and explain why we want to bypass this question, or we need to fix it.
Right. Okay. Well, that's partly an artifact of the way this working group works. I mean, even though the issues we're bringing up, it's such a small working group with a small number of people who speak. You often get, unless you get a number of members of the working group who want to move forward with something, we get consensus by silence an awful lot in this group without objection.
I'm sympathetic. You're not the only working group that has this problem, but that means if there's a small number of people that actually represent that consensus, and there's any challenge along the way, there has to be enough momentum to overcome that challenge, and I don't think it exists right now.
Okay, we have a couple of people in the queue, so let's turn to that and get them in here. So Jim Gould, you're up first. And Jim, if you're speaking, we're not hearing you. Okay, Andy, you had your hand up too. Why don't we go to Andy here? He's actually in the room. We'll come back to you, Jim, give you a moment to get organized.
So Jim is the authority on this topic. However, I did offer some text about the SMTP UTF-8. That's a mouthful. The EAI stuff, and I don't think I disagree with the characterization that we're kind of like saying this is unimportant. There is an issue about how many email addresses you can put in that are reasonable in that field, right? Because those email addresses get used for doing domain transfers and things like that. And if there's multiple of them, then you have this huge issue with how many, who do you send email to, and blah 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 blah. There are other. I went through and read John Clinton's comments, his last call comments, and there were some security considerations that I saw in there. And I believe we added them to this draft, basically saying you need to be, if you're going to do SMTP UTF-8, which the draft I believe allows you to signal for, then there are some precautions you have to take on what you allow in those email addresses, because it's the copy and pasting issue that is actually the security problem. So I think it's been addressed. If it hasn't, then we need to do whatever we need to do. Yeah.
Okay.
Jim Gould, do you want to try again?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Go ahead, please.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, thank you. Yeah, to, I guess, address Murray's question associated with a consensus. We had modified this draft multiple times based on the feedback. The last issue remaining was this cardinality issue. And I had posted a message to the list with the options, and we had 11 responses on the list, which it's got to be a record for regex, honestly, and positive for cardinality of 1. And so that was the working group speaking. And so we addressed all of the feedback that was received from the IETF last call. And I'm not exactly sure what your recommendation is associated with, I guess, supporting the cardinality of 1 position. Thank you.
Okay, so I put myself in the queue, and so now I'll jump in. I want to be careful. I want to tease something apart here, because even in my rereading of all this discussion and getting to the end and writing that summary, one thing occurred to me. I think the cardinality issue is in part a red herring. The discussion has never been about being able to support multiple email addresses. It should never have been about supporting multiple email addresses. I think that was just an issue that got confusing along the way. It really is about there being one email address, that is the contact address, and just about having the option as a policy matter external to all of this, although as I understood it in rereading John's comments, it's also about, from a technical point of view, what we do in the IETF with respect to email, right? You want to have the ability to make use of an all ASCII email address, because there are a lot of reasons why in the email experience, that's an important element. So there will always be one email address and then an alternative that may or may not be present. And whether or not it's present is entirely a policy issue on somebody's part, probably the registry, but whatever ICANN decides in that respect. So I wanted to tease out that comment from you, Jim Gould, about it's not about cardinality of 1 versus many. It's always cardinality of 1. It's just about an alternative to properly support email.
I think that's the flavor of what I remember from Philadelphia, at least. And I don't see that was addressed in the document when I looked at the diff between Philadelphia and today. I mean, I agree with Andy that there's been some stuff in security considerations. That general search and replace I also saw done, but this one thing seems to be. And then in the summary you provided, the disposition of the remaining question was like, we don't have to deal with that, and that's the part I'm questioning. Right. I don't think we can go ahead without dealing with that in some way. And if we're going to say that we have chosen not to deal with it, there has to be a good reason. So.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, and I see Jim Gould's hand up, I'll give him in just a moment. So yeah, what you're asking for is just how it is that what our answer was to this issue that was raised on the list. You consider it a substantial issue, and whatever we want to choose is fine, but we have to explain that choice in the document.
At least in the Shepherd write-up, if not in the document, yes. Because when it gets to the remainder of whoever, we still have to go through director reviews, we still have to go through full IETF review, and then we have to go through IESG evaluation. And whenever justification exists for not taking action on this, has to survive all that. And so it serves us well to shore up that argument if that's the argument we want to make, or realize that we can't and then deal with it some other way.
Okay, you actually said something important there that I wanted to call out, which is this explanation could go in the Shepherd write-up. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the document.
Yes,
But
it's true. But if you don't put it in the document, like director reviewers don't read Shepherd write-ups, so it may pop up as a result of like, wait a minute, what's this? So putting it in the document makes it more front and center. But either of those two are fine.
okay, all right, thank you. Jim Gould, you have your hand up.
Yeah, we can go ahead and add that something in the draft itself. And just to note, there was a prior version of the draft that actually had an alternate email address, and that did not work out very well for the working group. So we attempted that. We moved it back to be a single element, and we can go ahead and capture the reason why that is the case in the draft and hopefully the write-up. Shepherd write-up.
Okay, I think we're in a good place. Mary's nodding.
Let's take a run at that.
Okay, so the action is just to add some rationale to the document, and we'll figure out how to move that forward and get that done. Okay, we did take a little longer on that particular item, but I think that was an important conversation. This document has been hanging out for a while, and I'm glad we were able to move it forward. Okay, next slide, please. Actually, I think I'm back online. Maybe things will work here. Okay, so discussion about documents that are past working group last call, but not quite moved up yet. We have the OpenID document, just waiting for the document Shepherd write-up. Actually, I think we have a document Shepherd write-up for that, right? So we just have to review that and move that along. And redacted is also waiting for a document Shepherd write-up. I'm sorry, we do have that? We do have that too? Okay, all right, well, then it's on your chairs. You'll have to look at those two things and move them along. So thank you for that. Okay, last little bit here that I'm going to do, we'll move into quickly looking at existing work here. Just a quick statement. We have one new work item that it's a recently adopted document that is in front of this working group. Not much has happened with it since the last IETF, but we did adopt the document from Gavin Brown about being able to adjust the DNS TTLs, the NS record TTLs at the registry through the registrar. Kind of an important thing for registrars, registrants to be able to do as part of managing transitions of their DNS and such. So this is just calling out that that's an outstanding work item that hasn't been progressing. But then again, we have a whole bunch of newer work that we've been getting to. A lot has been going on in RDAP and other areas here. And if I could get these slides to move on here. Well, back over to you, Antoine.
I'm controlling the slide because you forgot something. The most important thing is we still need a document Shepherd for this document, right? So if there are any volunteers to be the document Shepherd for this document, please let yourselves know either to the authors or on the mailing list.
Right. It even says that right in front of me, and I failed to notice that and call it out. But thank you for that. This is the document that needs it. So, okay, with that, over to you, Antoine.
So I'll take over from here, and let's see what's the first thing on the agenda. It's Tom Harrison, and Tom is remote, I believe. So I will put up his presentation.
I actually don't see Tom in the room.
And I actually see him. No, I said he's remote. So,
hello?
Oh, I'm sorry.
You can hear you
it
just
name
fine,
up to the top. I'm looking in alphabetical order, but he goes to the top. Okay.
Okay, so Tom, you want to control your slide yourself, Tom?
Yep, sounds good.
Or, so you have control now. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So to recap briefly on this document, it defines some new searches for internet number resources. The first part is searching by handle and name for IP ranges and ASNs. The second is a set of new link relations and searches for moving up and down the object hierarchy for IPs, ASNs, and reverse domains. And the third part is extending reverse search so that it can be used for IPs and ASNs. The idea with doing this is that an RIR that implements this functionality ends up with an RDAP service that's a complete alternative to Whois. So that gives the RIR options around things like encouraging transition to RDAP, as well as, for example, having Whois be just a wrapper around a core RDAP service. So that's why we're doing it. There have been a few changes since the last meeting. One of the changes we made between 00 and 001 was to switch from using the term RIRs to INR registries, because there's nothing in the document that's specific to regional registries. It's all just internet number resource related content. But we got feedback at the last meeting that all the existing documents are in terms of RIRs, even though they have a similar, even though they're similarly situated. So on reviewing that, we switched back to using RIRs and just added some text in about it not being RIR specific. We had feedback at the last meeting about, because it was only supporting up and down searches, if you wanted to get to the top or the bottom of a hierarchy, you needed to repeat those searches until you got there. So short-circuiting that by providing top and bottom searches would be useful. So that's been added in. As part of that feedback, it was mentioned that it would be useful to be able to get to the delegation from an RIR to a member if you were way down the hierarchy. So to get to support that, we've added in a status query parameter to the searches, because those delegations will have a status of active, whereas delegations from, for example, IANA to a regional registry won't. So that's how we're supporting that. And we also defined the search path segments for each of the link relations. So rather than just having the document be in terms of link relations that you follow to find objects, so everything is in terms of some object you've retrieved, the search paths support arbitrary searches. So more similar to how things work in Whois at the moment. And a minor update is that the document is no longer marked as updating those earlier RDAP RFCs. We'd done that because we wanted to avoid the prefix in the URLs, but the advice at the last meeting was that that wasn't the way to deal with that. So we've just taken that out. We haven't put anything in, put anything in to handle that yet. So we still need to look at that. There are a couple of questions that came up after making the implementation changes. The first one is that the bottom search includes the argument object if nothing more specific covers it. So for example, if you have a /24 and a /25 under it, and you retrieve you follow the bottom link for the 24, you'll get back the 25 plus the 24. The idea is that the response will completely cover the argument. You'll get kind of the terminal point for each part of the argument. But this is arguably a little bit unintuitive, so it would be good if people could, if anybody had feedback on that, that would be good to have. The other question is whether the links in the objects should be mandatory if the relevant objects are present. And that, if we make it mandatory, then that means that the absence of the links can be used to infer the absence of the objects. So rather than having to follow a bunch of links to get back empty results, the client would save some time in that respect. So feedback on that would be useful. As far as next steps go, we are still pending input from the sub-regional registries, so we're following that up. The document, in the transition from being just about link relations to including search paths as well, there are still some parts of the document that are really written in terms of link relations. So we need to go through that and make sure all of those parts are fixed up. And the last thing is that, again, something that just came up during implementation, it would be useful to clarify that the status parameter applies to all objects in the result set. The idea there is that if somebody might think that if you put, for example, status equals active, then, and you do a top search, then it will stop when it reaches an object that doesn't have status equals active. So just clarifying that it's the full object set, so it can actually sort of skip holes in the hierarchy would be useful to make it clearer how it works. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Are there any questions for Tom? Oh, James, go ahead.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for publishing this draft. I did post a message to the list. I did a quick review. I didn't do it as deep as I will do in the future. But the main question I had was around the lack of the prefix on the pass segments and whether or not you consider other options. I put 2 in there, and maybe others. Like for example, one of them would be to define 2 different identifiers, one for the IPs and the other one for the OTNUMs, so that you would be able to use them as is in the pass segment instead of having to use a prefix, like a IRI R underbar. But anyways, I just wanted to ask whether or not you've thought about other options.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I did see that mail this morning, but I only skimmed it. But yeah, for sure, we're definitely open to other options there. And I think the idea of having, yeah, at least in principle, I think the idea of having the 2 extra identifiers just to avoid the prefix problem, I think that sounds fine. But I hadn't thought of any other ideas, but yeah, we'll look at that and send updates to the list. Thanks.
Okay, and then I put myself in the queue. Tom, if you could, since I was responsible for asking for the top-bottom searches, if you can go back to that slide. So yeah, the one next one. So is it a good idea? Bottom searches include the argument topic. So if I understand you correctly, you know, if I query specifically for a /20, let's say, and there are 2 /21s below, when I do a bottom search, I would expect to be returned to 2 /21s, right?
That's right. Yep.
So why wouldn't that be a good idea? Because it doesn't include the argument at that time?
No, that if in the case where the argument is completely covered by more specific objects, so the 221s under a 20, there's no problem because you don't get back the argument object. But if you had, for example, a single 21 under it, and you do the search for the 20, then it's about whether do you want to get back just that 21, or do you want to get back the 21 and the 20 to completely cover the argument?
I think you would want to get both back in that case, yes. Because I'm expecting, you know, to research or to query a particular IP address in that range, right? And from my query, you don't know if the bottom half of or the second half that I'm after.
Yeah.
So yeah, so basically that's what I would expect, right? If I query a /20 and there's only one /21 below it, then I will expect to get both back. If there are 2 /21s under it, I would expect to get back the 2 /21s.
Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Then Jasdeep, go ahead.
Hi, Jasdeep Singh, Erin. So I think, and that's all right, Antoine, what you're saying, but just want to clarify, the bottom is essentially talking about subnets, right? /21s. So if the intent was just to get the subnet layer, then, and if you ask for, let's say, /20 and there's only one /21, returning a /20, could it be confusing? So the semantics of bottom is something I think they need to be clarified, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I clarified the use cases on the list, right? Most of the time, when you are looking for a particular IP address, you want to get the real end user of the address space, and most of the time that's in the bottom of the hierarchy. That's what you get back by default when you do whois query as well. My concern was more with the top query, because the top query usually represents the allocation. So when you are in search of who is actually controlling this address space, I would expect the top query to give me the answer of the LIR that's responsible for the allocation, in terms of when you want to know where RPKI ROAS are maintained and stuff like that. So those were basically my use cases. I understood that in the hierarchy, when you look up one IP address, you go to the bottom anyway, right? And if you are looking for a particular prefix, and you do a bottom query, then you are notified that, hey, the particular prefix you're looking at is actually not the user of this address space, because there are still two objects below.
So I think that's cool, Antoine. I just wanted to clarify that, but it looks like as a use case you mentioned, you're all right with what Tom asked. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if there are no more questions for Tom, then thank you, Tom.
Thanks.
And get the discussion going on the list. I'll take you out of the jazz dip, and let's go to the next presentation on the agenda, which is, let's see. Yeah, now we will, if I go back to the share slides, you make this complicated, Jim. So we were here, and moving on to, no, we were actually here. Yes. Next on the agenda, it's a discussion on contacts, and we actually have two presentations on this. One is Mario about JS Contact, and after that there will be Andrew on Simple Contact. I want to ask everybody to have the discussion after the two presentations, so that we can actually have a proper discussion here. So we'll start with Mario. I'll put up your slides, Mario. These ones.
Can you share this? Can you scroll the slides for me, please?
Okay, I can put you in control, but I can also scroll the slides for you. That's fine. Okay.
This presentation is about the objections to JS Contact that have been raised on the mailing list and also in forums other than IETF. My consideration aim to show that these objections are, at least in my opinion, biased. Next slide, please. As far as I understood, the main objection to JS Contact are: it is too complex for ADAP, it is easy to get wrong, it should use a rate. Next slide, please. By design, JS Contact must represent the same information as JCard. Now, to my knowledge, ADAP implementers have complained more about the JCard structure rather than the JCard content. Therefore, if ADAP implementers haven't been concerned about those JCard elements that are inapplicable in ADAP, I wonder why they can be concerned about their JS Contact counterparts. In addition, in this case, unlike JCard, ADAP implementers would be supported in JS Contact implementation by two documents. But I do believe that the most important thing to outline is that since JS Contact is a multi-point purpose representation for contacts, RDAP implementation. Next slide, please. Next, please. Yes. This objection looks very vague to me and also inconsistent with the previous objection. Indeed, if we agree that JS contact is a highly structured and controlled data model, then we should also agree that the more structured and controlled a data model is, the less ambiguous it is, and the more it's difficult to get wrong. I can surely say that based on my experience with JS contact tools, you can't build wrong objects through a library fully supporting JS contact implementation and validation. Next slide, please. With regard to the discussion about if it's better to use maps instead of arrays, I think that it should be sufficient unambiguous, flexible, extensible, and validatable, and at the same time fully compatible with JCAD. Anyway, just to explain the author's decision to use maps, we have used a convention that is largely known by implementers. I mean, we have used maps for unordered collections and arrays for collection where order may be meaningful. In addition, when map keys are known in advance, like in the document about using JS contact in RDAP, getting a map entry is easier than looping on an array, and deserializing a map into an object could be straightforward, since a map is basically an object including members of the same type. Next slide, please. The last objection is about that patch object allows to localize both simple and complex values. Use the same process to get the localization of values, arrays, objects, including the card itself and extensions, and separate the core information provided in the default language from its localization. Definitely think that the focus should be on if this method is more efficient in terms of extensibility and flexibility than replicating the language information whenever it's needed. Next slide, please. My conclusion are that being a format fully compatible with JCAD, the amount of information JS contact can represent surely far outweighs the needs of others, but I consider it as a benefit, not a drawback. As opposed to JCAD, JS contact is highly structured tuned over time to achieve clearness, flexibility, and extensibility. Given that the discussion about using arrays instead of maps looks very simplistic to me. Finally, patch object is a flexible, extensible, and definitive method to handle any localization, and any alternative solution should be just as efficient. Next slide, please. And that's it.
So thank you, Mario. And then we immediately move to the next presentation, which is sort of like the other side of the discussion that took place on the mailing list. That is simple contact. So that's Andy. So Andy, go ahead.
All right. Are you clicking for me or?
Yes, I can do that.
Okay, thanks. So this whole thought about simple contact started when I started writing an RDAP client. And I noticed that looking at several RDAP servers, JCard is not implemented correctly on a lot of servers. It's not like it's there are a lot of very simple mistakes you can make with JCard that make it very hard to parse. And on a client, if you're writing client software, jcard is kind of a bear. So my whole thought process here was started off with, I want to write some software that can do jcard but has an internal data model that's compatible with JS Contact. And that caused me to take a very close look at JS Contact. And in so doing, I do not believe JS Contact is right for RDAP. I think it is complex, too complex for what we need, and suffers from many of the same problems that jcard does, just in different ways. All right, so next slide, please. So the original reason we have jcard to begin with is when the WIRDS working group was working on RDAP, the first 2 or 3 drafts of RDAP did not have jcard. They actually had its own internal contact model. And the people working on jcard at the time came to us and say, hey, you know, in the IETF, we eat our own dog food, so you should be using jcard. So we switched to using jcard, and that's how we ended up with that. But the problem is, again, that it's easy to get wrong. It's JSON that looks like nothing else in RDAP. And so both client implementers and server implementers have a hard time with it. And as I said, you know, after looking at JS Contact, it suffers from some of the same problems, just in different ways. And some of those ways are, and where you could get away with using arrays, they have these complex map structures, and patch objects are just it's not a very good solution for saving about 100 bytes of information. So it's a very complex solution for doing that. All right, so next slide. The other thing is when you take a step back, jcard and vcard and JS Contact, those are, you know, they're meant for being virtual business cards. And virtual business cards are a great thing for putting into you know, your virtual Rolodex or your contact or whatnot, but that's not registration data. There's overlap between registration data and a business card, but they're not the same thing. When you go to get a domain name or an IP address, you don't give them, at least I've never seen it, tell them what your organizational title is. You don't say, I'm the software vice president of operations, and can I please get this domain name or this IP address? So that kind of information is superfluous to RDAP. Both jcard and JS Contact have things like, you know, birthdays and wedding anniversaries and all sorts of things that just are not registration data. So when it gets down to it, this is not appropriate for RDAP. And to insist that a client implementer has to implement all these things that don't have any relevance to the problem they're working on is just a little more than we need. So the other thing is, so if you take a tour around, like looking for different libraries, you know, we were sold jcard, meaning that, hey, there's going to be all these third-party libraries for jcard and whatnot. That's absolutely not true. I can only find 2. So dealing with jcard, if you're a client implementer, is very difficult. You basically have to go implement it yourself. I don't know of any software, third-party software like Outlook or anything that ingests it. If Outlook does, I couldn't figure out how to do it. And so there's no indication to us that JS Contact is going to be any different. vCard, on the other hand, is the kind of dominant virtual business card format. So if anything, we want to be supporting vCard if that is the goal. So next step, next slide. Sorry, next step. So anyway, so I think one of the things that kind of we kind of get wrapped around the axle on is, you know, how do we put enough information into our contact model to know that we've covered all our bases without going too far. So that's, I mean, it's kind of like the enticing, the appeal of the other work of JS Contact and jcard and whatnot is like, well, it covers all the bases, supposedly. But we actually have enough deployment experience now with RDAP and who is that we actually know with fairly high confidence what the data elements are that we need. And so there's a, you know, a couple of RFCs, there's a profile that ICANN has, there's a profile that the NRO has. So we have a pretty good idea of what data we do need in RDAP. And I'm going to steal a comment from Jasdeep. Using thoughtful reduction, we can actually take what we need and model that, and then we reduce the burdens on both the server and the client implementers. Next slide, please. So here's the top level objects that Simple Contact supports. There's not a whole of them. It's less than 10. By doing this, we actually cut down on a lot of the information that that someone would have to go implement. A lot of the things they would have to do. So next slide. Oh, it's sitting in front of me. The other thing is when we create our own contact model, there are some things that there's some warts with both JS Contact and JCard that we get out of. So there's a requirement in JCard that the FN attribute has to always be populated, but that actually goes against a lot of server policy. The same is true for the UID in JS Contact. And we've had these long discussions on the mailing list about these things. But if we use our own contact model, we don't have to worry about trying to workarounds for these things. The other thing we put into the draft is a mechanism for being able to signal for the client, hey, I don't need JCard anymore because I understand whatever contact model you have. And so that would, in a lot of cases, that doesn't really matter because it's just extra data. But for when you're doing searches, that can actually be quite a lot of information. Additionally, because we can target our use case, the Simple Contact actually specifically addresses the int and loc information in our differences in EPP. Either JS Contact or JCard even address that. And then we're reusing the RDAP's laying attribute for internationalization. Next slide. So here's the feedback we've gotten so far. So when I first introduced this idea, a lot of people were, supportive of it. I do want to give a hat tip to Gavin Brown for pointing out that we did discuss this in 2019 or 2018. I'd completely forgotten about it. But for whatever reason, this was always associated specifically with EPP. And that was probably not I don't think that was ever the intent. So EPP is part of what guides us, but it's not the whole thing. So this is not an EPP data model, strictly. We put in a thing in the draft about structured names. Tom and I kind of don't think they're really necessary. They don't exist in the who is inventory that the guys from CNNIC did during the Weirds working group. There is one instance of that, and I guess we could ask the server operator who does that, or one instance that we know of, whether they actually need it or not. So Mario also pointed out that there are things like birthdays and national IDs, such as social security numbers, which should be in there. And I don't know of any RDAP servers that actually serve this information. I'm not sure we should put it in. That's kind of a working group decision, I guess. But that would be highly contentious, and we would have to have some pretty good privacy considerations around that. Which kind of goes to the fact that maybe for JCard and JS Contact, we should have some specific guidelines and privacy considerations around those as well. Let me see, I'm trying to go through these without taking up too much time. Mario did point out that we need to be a little more careful with the SMTP UTF-8 EAI emails, and I agree with that. So I think we need to spend a little more time thinking about that. He also pointed out that the current document, which we kind of put together in haste, needs better examples, and I agree with that as well. And then one of the interesting comments was Mark Blanchette said that JCard is here to stay. That is a very interesting observation in the fact that we currently have JCard. It's a mandate from, or it's required by the ICANN GTLD RDAP response. I would say that JCard is here for a long time, but I don't think that's always going to be required. So even that response profile gets updated every once in a while. So anyway, that's all I have.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. To put a little bit of structure in the discussion that we're going to have, if you have specific questions to one of the presenters, please tell me so I can ask them to give the feedback. If it's a general discussion item for everybody to answer, then please join the queue to get answers. So the first one in the queue that I have is Mark Blanchette. Mark, go ahead.
Hello, Marc Blanchet. RDAP client implementer on Kotlin in Swift, iOS and Android. Okay, we cannot rewrite the past. I think we would all love. G-card is ugly to parse, but we have, the cost is already, in the past in some ways, right? And then I'm seeing GS, so there's those two proposals, pros and cons on each, and I'm not sure which one would be the best, but we don't want to have 3 of them. And I'm concerned, I'm sorry, Andy, but if GS Contact is going for other protocols, for calendar or whatever else, then we choose simple contact, then we will have yet another library of contacts. It would be great to have only one. And Andy, you're right that servers are sending shit. But it, as an implementer of a client, being used a lot, I actually, looking at all those, and it's been very much better, every month. So, and that problem is going away. So yeah, and actually what I'm seeing is more about the other things than the G card as the problem of the response from the server, so especially now that contact is essentially just everything redacted.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Next one in the queue, Q.
Hello, I'm coming to this from the perspective of a domain registrar, and I've written the RDAP server for that. Generally, I support this. JCard and JS Contact, I've found both of them to be needlessly complicated for what's required for a domain registrar. The extent of really what I need to send back is what's someone's email address, what name have they told me they have, and what's their postal address, and maybe their telephone number. Like the extent of stuff that you can throw into JCard is far too much, and it just makes everything more complicated than it should be. So I support simple contact, and I think that should be the way moving forward. On a few of the points that have been raised, such as structured postal addresses and structured names, I don't think they're worthwhile, especially like structured names. I'm sure most of you have seen the infamous blog posts of falsehoods programmers believe about names. We should really just have like a field for what is your name, because that's all you need to know. Just like, here's some UTF-8 that what should I call you? And the same for a postal address, because I've read the Universal Postal Union standard, which is a UN standard for how a postal address should be encoded. The standard there contains every possible format of a postal address in the world. It's so complicated, it has its own domain-specific executable language to generate a postal address. We should not try and structure a postal address. We should just have like, here are some lines of a postal address. Just put new line characters in. It's fine. You're just going to print this on the front of an envelope to post someone something. It's up to the postal system to deal with, get it somewhere. And in many countries, the postal address is not really structured anyway. It's a vague set of instructions for, oh yeah, it's that building next to that other building in that town. And we can try all we want to make these structured and make this lovely format which can describe everything perfectly, but I think that's unnecessary for what we're trying to achieve, and we should just go for, here's some UTF-8 that a human will find useful.
Okay, thank you, Q.
Sure.
Next, Werner.
So Andy wants to respond directly.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. I totally agree with you about the structured names. Tom and I kind of went back and forth on this. I want to point out that Tom pointed me to the discussion in CalExt. There was a working group last call, or maybe it was the IETF last call, about structured names. And one of the reviewers came back and said, this is wrong, the way they did it. So one of my issues with structured names is if we try to do it, we're going to mess up. Because currently the way even in simple contact, it's very westernized. And I don't think that works the way we've even done it right now. And I don't think the way JS Contact does it works, and I know JCAR doesn't work with non-westernized names. So my opinion is that we should not even attempt it. So, yeah, I agree with you. Yes.
I'll take the risk of arguing in favor of complexity.
And your name is, for the record?
Because
Werner,
I've seen...
your name for the record?
Oh, sorry. My name is Werner Staub, Core Association. I've seen simplification come back with the vengeance of complexity so many times. And specifically in the context, it has done so to the point of actually torturing us, and specifically, of course, all our communities. Now, we have simplified things before, such as saying that a registrant is a contact, just like another contact. It didn't used to be like that. We ended up in that simplification, confusing an individual with an organization, because in the past, the earlier domain names were mostly organizations, and you had persons attached to that organizations. And then suddenly, that was just, just a contact. The register is going to be a contact. We did that 22 years ago. And suddenly, we're ending now in a situation where we're saying, oh, we're actually not sure if we are referring to a contact that is a person or an organization. And we came up with this strange solution of saying, oh, if the organization field is set, then actually the registrant is meant to be the organization. And also we've behaved in all these years as if nothing had been made in terms of progress elsewhere, such as identifying organizations. I mean, just organizations. Great progress has been made to identify them. We don't even have organization identifiers in our EPP data model. We do have a public ID in RDAP. It is not used other than for the IANA registrar ID when the entity is an IANA registrar. So we started using that for some of our cases in our registries. We just put in that the company number that we have in some of our registries, but it's not there in the data model. There's no standardization in there, and very often actually when we want to say this is a certain party, the party happens to have a certain number of details about them that can change, but the essence is who they are. And so it would be good to at least have the ability to say, yes, we're talking about that party. If there is some kind of universal identifier for companies, it's easy. For individuals, lots of work is being done for decentralized identity and so on, and we don't see anything in our data model. So I think maybe the good idea would be to say, take another step back and think more as to how we could solve those problems as well. And then we probably wouldn't be so much concerned about complexity. I mean, we could even have many formats.
Okay, thank you, Werner. And for all the rest, I've closed the queues. We have 5 minutes left. Next one is Paul.
Pavel Kowalik, Denik. So I would opt for the option of the simple contacts. Let's say not in favor of the complex ones. So JCAT was a bit of a difficulty already in RDAP model, but my enthusiasm after reading the proposal was a bit vanished because this simple contact proposal is not that simple. I think I will copy Mark that we have just one chance to do it right again. And I will be looking a bit forward to alignment with identity worlds, because especially in Europe with NIS2 implementation, we have to align with EID, e-wallets. So there are data models coming from this direction, and I would look for some alignment here.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Jasdeep, you're next.
Hey, Jasdeep Singh, Erin. Sorry, I'm walking with my computer here. I'm in a bit of an awkward position because I'm a document shepherd for JS Content, and I love Mario. Um, and then we have simple contact. So just to clarify that first. So I think I echo Mark's point and what Pavel said. Given the smallness of this group, perhaps one choice is better than working on two things. So that's the second point I wanted to make. And thirdly, I think uh, since I've studied JS Contact, I think Andy's right in one sense that the patch object and ID concepts, I think there are optimizations which are used, as he echoed that you're saving some bytes, right? But they look hard to implement if you're not using a library. And I know we have a library vis-a-vis JS Contact tools, what Mario gracefully put together, right? But then you hear languages like Kotlin, Swift, I can keep going with other languages. So that ecosystem takes time to create. Whereas the basic simple JSON, and I'm not very strong about array versus objects. Yeah, they are like Russian dolls intertwined at times. But these two concepts are pretty tricky because they involve JSON pointer and then the IDs, meaning you have dynamic strings as names. So yeah, I think that's something we should be mindful of. And finally, I think one point I heard was, which is, yeah, let's assume you go with simple contact, right? Just for argument's sake. And extending that thoughtful reduction point, what Andy was making, it's about meaningful reductions and then thoughtful additions. And let's say we miss something in simple contact, okay? Just for argument's sake, vis-a-vis all the regions of the world, we always have the option of extending it on demand. The point I make there is that, after all, it's also an extension. The whole point of extensions, you can keep evolving it. Yeah, hopefully not too often, but it'll be additive rather than subtractive. So anyway, those are some of the points. I'm still, given my position, I just would like one.
Okay, thank you, Jasdeep. And the last one in the queue, or if, yeah, Mario, I see you in the queue. I will give you an opportunity to speak as one of the presenters after this. But first, let's hear it from Jim.
Thank you. Jim Galvin for the record, and standing in the center microphone to emphasize that I'm speaking for myself. Two things. One, first, I'm a very strong proponent of simplicity and always have been. And frankly, I really like the direction that Andy's going in. If anything, I would say what you proposed is still too complicated. But, you know, it's all a matter of opinion and judgment. And in fact, I like the comment, I'm sorry, I don't know you, that you were making earlier about, you know, I'm also a strong proponent of internationalization, and I very much agree, you know, that we are so westernized in what we do, and addresses and named addresses is one of those things. It's just sort of a little pet peeve of mine, but I've never really known how to go about fixing all of that. That's just sort of odd. So I think this is just, you know, good work, and we should do all of this, and we should move in this direction. And I like having the option of being able to take advantage of simple contact, or whether it's JCard or JS Contact, whatever it is, which brings me to my second point, just an observation to be made as someone who participates actively on both the ICANN side and the IETF side of these kinds of things. You know, JCard, we've made that comment a few times here, is kind of here to stay. The IETF has its own reasons for, you know, making JCard be motivated and stick around, but that's also true on the ICANN side. So, you know, the policies on that side actually do mandate JCard. So the reality is, if we want something else to come into existence, we have to make that option available. And then as a separate step, you know, there's a set of people, myself included, who would have to start motivating that action on the other side to see if we can't move to something else. So, you know, we kind of have to decide if we want to have this option and then make it available. That's the only way to satisfy the problem on the other side. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And then Mario, I can give you 30 seconds of response, and then we have to move on to the other agenda items. And
Thanks.
let's continue this discussion on the list, right? Go ahead, Mario.
What we should think about is, first of all, backward compatibility with JCAD. So JS Contact is able to be fully compatible with JCAD, including any JCAD extension. So and another point is I think that we should focus on a model that is extensible and flexible. So we don't know what will be the requirements in the future about the registration data. So if we represent the contact information as limited to the cases that are in use today in other forced to update the simple contact data model with many extensions. So I think that it's better to think about a representation that is extensible and flexible, so that any extension could be represented with little effort, or just, for example, defining new value for kind, or for the kind values, or something like that. So I think this is the point. If we want to limit it, to limit the contact representation to what is now, obviously we can use simple contact the current information. So
Mario, if I can interrupt you,
so
please.
much different in the two data models based on that information. The difference is in that JS Contact is much more flexible and extensible.
Mario, I gave you 2 minutes now, and you only had 30 seconds. We have to respect, the other presenters that are still going to present. I really like this discussion. I think it was very good, but I think we should continue with the arguments on the mailing list. It was a very good discussion, and let's continue there. And we are going ahead with the next presentations. And the next thing on the agenda, and I have to bring up the slide shares again.
Dear chairs, can I interrupt a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Marc Blanchet, it would be good to have like the tool, the MeetEco tool poll for, what people think about the different things while we're here.
Okay, that's an interesting suggestion. I'll try and work that with Antoine here in the background as we move on. So we can pick
Okay,
it up
so I'll what he meant was have a poll right now, right, during the meeting. So let's do that after the new work presentations. If we have any time, we'll put up a poll so that people can discuss still a little bit, and do it at the end of the meeting. So next one up is Bill Carroll, and I see him already available remote. So Bill, I will put up the slide that I think Scott prepared to you.
I hope so.
Yeah, it's the lead BCP.
All right,
and there we go. And we can hear you just fine. So go ahead, Bill.
All right, and you can hear me?
One thing I forgot to ask, do you want to control the slides?
No, there's only 4 of them. If you want to just do them, that's easier.
Okay, that's good.
Okay. All right, so my name is Bill Carroll, and I work with Scott Hollenbeck at VeriSign. And I'm going to briefly introduce this draft, which we wrote that's intended to give best practices around object deletion in EPP. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so let me give a little history and background. If you were at the IETF 115 meeting at the IETF Open group, Gautam Akawate presented a paper called Risky Business, which details a known problem with a workaround to some EPP recommendations that some registrars had implemented, and it was causing thousands of domains to be hijacked. So in response to that, we have prepared this BCP hoping to explain some things about the EPP RFCs and then offer some best practices and some sort of moves going forward. So first thing we're in here is that in RFCs 5731 and 5732, which Scott wrote, there are a number of recommendations, should and should not language, but there's kind of inadequate explanations and expectations around them. And that's caused some issues when they've been rigidly applied. So in terms of these best practices, we are limited to what these are best current practices. So they're limited to what's currently available. And then we also hope to give some directions for the next potential practices we'd like to see. Can you go to the next slide? So let me briefly explain the problem. And if you want more details, I would recommend seeking out that Risky Business paper or the presentation, and you'll get kind of a fuller example and numbers and so on. So RFCs 5731 and 5732 have these focus on very singular, discrete steps for deleting objects. And the goals were to avoid breaking resolution, to maintain client server registrar registry data consistency, and to maintain relational consistency within the server, within the registry. So they state that a domain object should not be deleted if subordinate host objects are associated with it. And you can see in my example here, deleteme.example has a host object ns1.deleteme.example. It doesn't really matter for this purpose whether it's a narrow or wide glue. So it doesn't matter if deleteme.example is using it or not, but it now has this associated host object, which needs to be deleted first, or perhaps in the same transaction or something like that. But the problem is if there's a second rule here that says, recommendation, I should say, a host name object should not be deleted if the host object is associated with any other object. And in this case, dependent.example is also associated with ns1.deleteme.example. So now we can't delete deleteme.example without deleting ns1.deleteme.example, and dependent.example depends on that, so we can't delete that. Okay. Now, if they have the same sponsoring registrar, then that registrar could dissociate dependent.example from ns1, and everything would be fine. But if they have different sponsoring registrars, that option is not available. All right. And so we come to that third point. What we see instead is we rename that host object to often an external sacrificial name server, and that maintains the consistency within the registry. And now we can delete deleteme.example because it doesn't have any associated subordinate host objects. The problem is now dependent.example is dependent on something new, and that's unexpected for the dependent domains registrar and registrant. They're not informed of the change. And if that new domain is taken over by someone else, it offers an option for domain hijacking. And that has occurred in thousands of cases. All right, so if you go to the next slide. So we wanted to talk about what we think are the best practices around this. The first were 4 practices to avoid, and the first 3 are must nots. We think these are bad. The fourth one is a should not, because we're kind of open to it, but we need to get more consensus around it. The first is, of course, this renaming hosts to presumed non-existent external hosts. This is irresponsible because it creates hijacking opportunities. The second that was suggested actually at that IETF Open meeting is the use of .alt. And we don't think that that the use of non-DNS identifiers in the DNS is a good idea. This could cause unpredictable behavior, name collisions. This just mixes DNS namespace with this non-DNS with the non-DNS pseudo TLD. So this seems problematic. The third is something we've actually observed in the wild, is sometimes these hosts will be pointed to, usually, I mean, they're glue records and so on, to an existing recursive service, which then offers a DNS service, but it's going to give serve fail or other errors for any requests for those domains. And actually, I am a co-author on another draft over in DNS op called Negative Caching of DNS Resolution Failures. The reason is there are some recursives that will aggressively requery when they receive serve fail or some other errors. And so in this case, making this change will create operational problems as you get many spurious requests, and these domains can never be resolved. So it doesn't work really for anyone. That fourth one, which is again a should not, because some registrars are doing it now, is the use of AS112.ARPA. And we would really prefer that there be a community well understood rename instead of using something that's a special name for another purpose. And we think this leads to confusion. If a registrant sees this, it's not clear what happened or what this means. So coming over to the best and better practices, we would like to see registrars maintain a sacrificial name server host, and it needs to respond with non-error, non-failure, authoritative responses. The draft is open as to what that response might be, because we want to allow for the idea of maybe controlled interruption IPs or some other signaling mechanism, but nothing that's going to be an error or a failure, because again, we want to avoid that aggressive requerying. The other option that some registries already are implementing is they are allowing deletion. And that is in the RFC, again, those are recommendations, so that's allowed. What we really don't have a good understanding of is what guardrails there are around that. What are the practices and safeguards around that? Does that mean that the dependent.example is removed from the zone entirely? Does that mean DS records go away? We don't know. And finally, coming to what we think would be better practices, we would really like to see a community sacrificial name server, either service or convention, something where, again, registrants and registrars could understand what happened and what this is supposed to be. So that could be a sacrificial name server.ARPA, or some sinkhole service, something along those lines. The other option is to move registries towards deletion of the host objects, but in that case, do we inform registrars, the deleting registrar, of the details of that and require an explicit delete? And if so, then what do we need to share with them? And is there a way to inform affected registrars and registrants so that it's not a surprise for them? So this is only the first version of this draft, and we are open to any suggestions or practices we've missed. So I'm open to any questions or comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. We have a few minutes to questions. So Q, go ahead.
Hi. Your point about AS112 is interesting. This is just what I thought of sat down. So this isn't a very well formulated idea, but it might have some possibility of working. So the community sacrificial name service, why shouldn't that be something that is kind of involved with AS112, since home.ARPA is already delegated to AS112? So we could delegate invalid.ARPA to AS112 as well, and then say point to ns1.invalid.ARPA or just invalid.ARPA or something, and then the problem is solved, I think.
Yeah, that's an option to consider. again, I think our focus is on making sure that it's something that can be well understood in the community, so that if someone is registrar is able to scan for it amongst their customers, basically so that it's not a surprise and it's not a mystery as to what happened to the name servers for a domain.
Hey, Ed, go ahead.
Ed Lewis, I can. And I've been out of this for a while, so I'm coming back to the discussion midstream. One thing in looking at this, we know that putting in like a dummy value for something is always going to be treacherous, whatever the dummy value is. We've done that for years of programming. The question I have there, though, is that in the better best practice, we talk about sacrificial names. We can reserve names certain ways. But I think you want to have two goals here. One is a goal that software will not accidentally use that name. They might think interpret that correctly. But also you want to have a name that when the operator sees it, eyeballs it, they know what's going on, right? That's a different kind of fallback we have here. And in the second part, having one name may be difficult if it turns out that you have multiple names being deleted from different reasons. You don't want to track back what this one was replacing. So I'll just throw that in there as I can just see as obvious issues we have to solve for this to work.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you, Bill. And just a remark from me, I remember that I have had these discussions about host objects already in 2001. So that's 22 years ago, and apparently nobody has solved it yet. I think it's about authority of records, and it has a lot to do with clue and everything. But it might be good to go back to that discussion in 2001. So thank you, Bill. Since we have little time, I locked the queue, and we're moving to the next presentation, and I think that is Andrew. So thank you, Will. So let me put up Andrew's slide. Which one do you want to start with, Andrew? I think it's the RDAP extensions, right?
Sounds good to me.
Hello.
All right. So I don't know if some of you remember, maybe about a year ago, there were a lot of discussions on the mailing list about how RDAP extensions work. And I would say that we had a lot of people talking past each other. So that was kind of the driving motivator for writing this draft. And next slide, please. So Jasdeep and I and Tom Harrison have gotten together to try to pull everything together into one place, because part of the problem with RDAP extensions is it's specified in multiple places in the RDAP RFCs, and there's no one coherent document that talks about them. So that's what we're trying to do here. I will say that this was the original intent was to write just an informational, but as we've gotten into this, there are a couple of things that may need fixing in RDAP around this. Nothing crucial or nothing that's going to cause the world to fall apart, but it'd be better to address them sooner or later. So informational was the intent, but this may not be an informational when it gets down to it. Next slide, please. All right, so what we discovered along the way, so we talk about, we've had these conversations about query parameters and so forth and extensions. The drafts, the actual RFC drafts talk about using extension prefixes or the extension identifier prefixes in the URIs and URLs. It really talks about using those for paths, but not the query parameters. So that's probably something we might want to clarify, in that it probably should be used for the query parameters as well. There was also no guidance on extensions that depend on other extensions, so we probably need to clarify how that would work. One of the things is that, and this kind of showed up in the RAR reverse search draft, right? The IETFs, because IETF owns the RDAP specification, the IETF actually doesn't have to abide by the rule where you need to use the extension identifier, because the IETF has the ability to coordinate itself. The whole purpose of those extension identifiers was for third parties who come in and add extensions to RDAP. So there's most of the time, I think most of the time we do abide by that in the IETF, but we might want to clarify whether we should or should not. Obviously, because the IETF can change its mind 10 years down the road. It's not fixed in stone, but we may want to create some guidance on that. And then one of the other things that kind of showed up was that you can have people registering extension identifiers which are supersets of existing extension identifiers, and that would be bad. So we should probably disallow that. Next slide, please. So the other feedback we've gotten on this is there needs to be explicit guidance about prepending the identifiers versus exact matching of the extensions. That's true. We should probably have clearer definitions on what needs to be documented, and we need to probably be clearer about how we talk about JSON in this draft, and make it, if not using the same terminology, try to map back to what the other RDAP RFCs say. And then, yeah, and then there's some comments about camel casing. So I don't think it was against it, but maybe we need to tighten it up. I don't know. Anyway, that's all I have. Welcoming feedback.
So are there any questions from Mr. Newton on this first presentation? I don't see, yes, I see Dan Keatley in the queue. Dan, go ahead.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, thanks. Yeah, just one question or observation regarding the rules for who has to use the prefixes and who doesn't. It would be hard. It's a hard sell for me to not eat our own dog food, so to speak. And it seems to me like if we put something in a spec and expect people to follow it, I would expect that should apply to us as well. Subtleties like that, where some extensions are required to do it while others aren't, to me seems like a source of ambiguity that drives the need for such a draft as this to further explain what our intent is. Special cases are generally bad, and if an extension is an extension is an extension, and the rules surrounding prefixes should be globally applicable if we can help it at all. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
All right. Sounds like a reasonable position to me. So, anyone else? All right.
If not, then I put up slides for your next presentation.
All right. All right. So this is a new media type for RDAP. Next slide, please. This came about from discussions of both JS Contact and the versioning work that James Gould is doing. And the idea was to try to extract out of there a generality of how do you get clients to be able to signal to servers the extensions they support, because that's what those are trying to do. So this is a generalized mechanism for that. Currently in RDAP, there's a way for a server to say to a client, here are the extensions I have that I support, but there's no way for a client to say that to a server. So that's what this is all about. And some of the current use cases are like being able to signal that you don't want JCard anymore, you want another contact model. So that's kind of one of the reasons you might want to do that. Also for versioning if you wanted to. All right, so next slide. So the solution we came upon was to create a new media type. And so this media type would create what's called a media type parameter. It would just be extensions, and it's just a white space separated, there we go, I got it. White space separated list of the RDAP extension identifiers. So that's how it would work. It would just be in the accept header along with the current RDAP media type. Next slide. Yeah, so the client behavior is if they support this, they send along both the current RDAP media type and the new RDAP-X media type, and they signal which extensions they support. Next slide. And if the server supports it, what they do is they respond with the RDAP-X media type in the content type header. 'Cause today what they have to do is they have to respond with the RDAP media type. So if they respond with the RDAP-X media type, then it signals to the client that they support this as well. Next slide. All right, so why a new media type? And RFC 6838 discourages the practice of appending media type parameters on existing media types. And it's for good reason, because a lot of server software, the HTTP layer, when it's handing things off to the application layer, the media type from the accept header is usually just going to be an opaque string. There's not going to be any structure around that. So if we tried to extend the current media type, what would happen is servers that are looking for the current media type would not get a string match, and they would probably reject it or whatever. So we had to go to the new media type. But this is backwards compatible. Next slide. The other thing is, in the draft, we actually talked about the justification of why we went down this route versus using query parameters. And query parameters have a host of problems. There's the copy and paste issue. If you copy your URL, which has the query parameter in there that says I support extension X, and you give it to someone who has a client that doesn't support that, but they use it, their client just signaled to the server something that's wrong. So the other thing is that, and this is probably the biggest issue, is the query parameters do not survive redirects. That means it's incompatible with RFC 7480, which talks about handling of query parameters both from the server and the client. And it's more importantly, incompatible with current RDAP deployments. So there are RDAP servers out there which use redirects quite heavily, and this will not, query parameters will not work with them. It also, when you get down to a kind of an architectural level, removes the content negotiation from the accept header. So where it probably should be. We have some sample code in the appendix, which kind of demonstrates how all this works, and the fact that most HTTP libraries, you can preserve query parameters, but the default is not to do that. The accept header is the opposite. So most libraries will preserve what the media types are. Next slide, please. Because there have been a lot of discussions about extension versioning, we actually did some thinking about how we could be compatible with that. And so there's a discussion in the appendix about how this is compatible with any type of extension versioning scheme that would come along. So carefully note that this draft does not specify any extension versioning. So next slide. Yeah, so the feedback we've gotten so far, there's a use case or kind of a corner case where the server could respond with extensions they don't support. They shouldn't be doing that, so we should probably put some guidance in there for that. Because you can put weights in the accept header about which media type you support, we should probably be a little more prescriptive about that. It was asked why we didn't go down the route of using a custom HTTP header. The reason we didn't do that is probably because that's very painful. I will note that the W3C attempted what's called the accept profile header a couple of years ago in 2019. They didn't get very far. I don't think RDAP specifying a new HTTP header is a solution that would bear any fruit. So Pavel, I hope I'm saying your name right, did mention that we should consider the use of the options method in HTTP or in /help. I think that's a very good comment. So we're going to look into doing that, maybe creating some sort of marker profile that goes into /help. Options, I'm not sure about. I need to look at that. RC 7480 does say RDAP only supports get and head methods, but we can still look at that. And then there was some conversation about this doesn't work with a raw browser. It actually does, but it's not a pretty solution. Or just a regular web browser is not a pretty RDAP solution to begin with. And I think that's it. So any other comments?
Okay, so we have we actually have run over time, so I want to ask the questions, have the questions short. Actually, the first one in the queue, Murray, is James Gould.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
So he goes first. And I see that James got offline. So then it's Murray.
Two quick things. One, I think it's funny that we banished X dash, but you're adding dash X. This is a mechanism by which you're telling the server, I can accept extensions in the answer.
Yes.
Right. So is there going to be a stipulation that says you always have to give RDAP plus JSON plain and then also include this? Because if you flip that, you might create a situation where I can't accept the answer that the server wants to give me.
So the client always sends both media types.
That's it.
Yeah. All right. And the reason it's RDAP-X is because when you look at the IANA registry, because originally it was extensions-RDAP or something like that, and Jesdeep pointed out that this will be up here in the registry and then the RDAP will be down here. So the RDAP-X is actually, so they'll be right next to each other. All right. Anything
Okay,
else?
I see that James Gould is back. James, you have half a minute left for a remark, a question. Jim Gould, we cannot hear you. Okay, so he's gone offline. I think he has audio issues. Since we ran out of time, I want to thank everybody. Unfortunately, there's no time left for a poll or any other business. So I hope that we will continue the discussion on the mailing list. It was a very good meeting. Thank you all for being here. And yeah, 6 minutes over time. Jim, I'll let you close the meeting.
Okay. We're adjourned. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what we needed.